Welcome to an online content module for the 6th grade Georgia Standards of Excellence in Social Studies. Today we'll be exploring an important topic from your history standards. Watching this video will help you know what your students need to understand about Cuba, then and now. Some important notes about this standard bear discussion. Although there's only one element, it's packed with rigor for students as they wrestle with two different but related examples of conflict and change in Latin America. Students need to know what the Cuban Revolution is, but only in order to explain its impacts. Explaining impacts can be a very broad idea, but we've narrowed it in our discussion today to immediate and long-term impacts. Additionally, students will have to describe the current relationship between Cuba and the U.S. And this happens to be a hot topic in the news since there's been so much transition in that relationship in the past decade. As a top-notch social studies teacher, we know that you'll keep yourself up to date with developments in the U.S.-Cuba relationship, and we'll have some suggestions for how to help your students do so as well. Cuba became a colony of Spain in 1492, and soon after, large numbers of slaves were brought to work the coffee and sugar plantations, adding ethnic diversity and numbers to Cuba's American Indian and Spanish colonial population. Cuba gained full sovereignty from Spain in 1902, and the period afterwards saw Cuban governments destabilized in multiple coup attempts, with a fragile democracy always teetering on the edge of revolution. While this information is not necessary for students to know for assessment purposes, since your geography standards for Latin America ask students to understand how African slavery impacted this region, as well as how this region became a Spanish-speaking one, it is appropriate to provide students with the background knowledge necessary that will help them to make connections to understand the essence of the standard, the impacts of the Cuban Revolution, and the resulting relationship with the United States. By 1952, Cuba had a corrupt dictator, Fulgencio Batista, who had seized power without being elected by the people. His ineffectiveness resulted in high unemployment and poor infrastructure, making it difficult for Cubans to have access to basic necessities. Multiple movements were begun by different factions to depose Batista, but the 26th of July movement was the one that was successful. It was a series of organized revolutionary actions spearheaded by Fidel and Raul Castro, brothers, and Che Guevara. This group first attempted to remove Batista through the court system, and when that didn't work, armed revolt against the National Army followed. After 7 years of guerrilla warfare, Batista was finally and permanently ousted. The winners in the Cuban Revolution worked to immediately set up government structures and secure the country. Trials were held, and members of the military or government who had remained loyal to Batista were executed, exiled, or imprisoned, and the country's military, composed of those who had previously been guerrilla fighters, became an organized fighting force. The new government was initially progressive, establishing equality for black Cubans, greater rights for women, necessary infrastructure to improve sanitation and health, public education, and development of the arts. However, by 1960, the government, under the leadership of Fidel Castro, actively pursued communist ideals through the nationalization of all land ownership. He ultimately banished the state religion, Catholicism, breaking one of the last vestiges of Spanish influence on the island. By 1965, the Communist Party of Cuba was formed and cemented into the nation's constitution. These are some of the most important short-term impacts of the Cuban Revolution. There were some also long-term impacts that your students should be aware of. Government dissenters across Central and South America were emboldened by the success of Castro's group and sought to free their own countries from oppressive rulers, leaving much of Latin America open to the communist or so-called leftist influence which impacted Latin American countries as diverse and far-flung as Chile and Nicaragua. The alliance the Cuban government made with the USSR during its Cold War standoff with the West brought Cuba in direct conflict with its closest neighbor, the United States. We were already committed to supporting the eradication of communism in Asia. We'll spend more time looking at this conflict in just a moment. Also, many Cubans disagreed with the direction of the government and began migrating to the United States by various routes. In all, over 500,000 Cubans left the island as a result of conditions, resulting in 1.9 million Cuban Americans by the time of the 2010 census, with more still arriving. These are some of the most important long-term impacts of the Cuban Revolution. Cuba's relationship with the United States struggled almost immediately after the revolution ended. While the U.S. government initially recognized the new Cuban leadership, problems quickly arose as it became apparent that Cuba was building a close friendship with the Soviet Union, our opponent in the Cold War. Cuba's complete embrace of communism strained the relationship with the U.S. to its breaking point. So, the U.S. slashed sugar imports, banned nearly all exports to Cuba, and ultimately declared a full embargo, including travel restrictions. Interestingly enough, many facets of the embargo are still in effect at the making of this presentation, more than 50 years later. This history standard provides you with a wonderful opportunity to explore the use of embargoes, one of the trade barriers listed in your economic standards. This historical example will help to clarify for your students the circumstances under which an embargo, rather than a tariff or quota, might be used, such as this response to conflict with another nation. If you want your students to gain a better understanding of the types of economic sanctions the U.S. has used in its efforts to influence Cuba, consider having them use the Cuban Research Institute website. Their link is listed at the end of this presentation. With the situation 90 miles south of Florida becoming ever more serious, even more desperate measures were taken, including the failed Bay of Pigs invasion that served only to heighten tension between the two countries. The climax to the conflict came the following year, when it was discovered that the USSR, our arch rival, was preparing to build nuclear missiles in Cuba. This action required something more serious than economic sanctions, as the Soviet Union was already providing financial support to Cuba that enabled it to weather the sanctions without much sacrifice. Americans asked their government to do something about this new threat. Showing students protest photos when the situation connects to your curriculum is really helpful to them, as it helps to draw a clear contrast between processes in democratic governments, especially when they're compared to authoritarian governments such as that in Cuba. Ultimately, in this conflict, both nations agreed, more or less, that isolation was the best course of action. Of course, with time and world events, even old animosities fade. Major developments occurred beginning in 2009 when presidential order established limited travel and immigration reform. Within a relatively short period of time, relations improved to the extent of opening embassies and lifting all travel bans. Help students trace the change in Cuba-U.S. relations with reputable sources, including the Council on Foreign Relations, a nonpartisan nonprofit group whose website lists the detailed changes in policy between our two countries over the past 50 years. Cuba's relationship with the United States has changed significantly in the 21st century. In 2016, President Obama becomes the first sitting U.S. president since 1928 to visit Cuba. The first commercial flights between the U.S. and Cuba have also been reinstated. Let's take a look at the news announcement of this new relationship from December 2014. I have the sound turned down here. President Castro, Raul Castro at this time, who became president in 2008, is providing his aspect of the speech to the citizens in his country to help them understand what the change in relationship will be about. Showing this video to your students will be very helpful to them, although they may not be very familiar with reading the subtitles when it's in a foreign language. So you may have to do some support with that. But we're going to scroll ahead just a little bit to where the president at the time, Barack Obama, also provided information to
with the people of Cuba. The most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years. We will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries. I've instructed Secretary Kerry to immediately begin discussions with Cuba to reestablish diplomatic relations that have been severed since January of 1961. Going forward, the United States will reestablish an embassy in Havana, and high-ranking officials will visit Cuba. Where we can advance shared interests, we will, on issues like health, migration, counterterrorism, drug trafficking, and disaster response.
Your job as a teacher of 6th grade World Area Studies is to help your students keep up with where this relationship goes. How can you incorporate inquiry and keep up with what's current and newsworthy, written at kids' reading levels? Textbooks can only tell us about past conflict, but they can't keep up with the changes that happened 3 weeks ago. A well-loved source to support social studies teachers is News ELA. Let's take our last minute together to check out this amazing resource. One thing you'll need to know is that this is a website that you'll want to open an account with, and so that you can sign in. Once you sign in, you can save the articles that you choose. Notice that they have a search bar conveniently located right here, and I've already plugged in searching for Cuba, and you can see that there are a number of different things. There's primary sources, as this is from the Cuban Missile Crisis, so primary sources responding to that crisis that you could use to teach that aspect of one of the impacts of the Cuban Revolution. Also, you could focus on the leader, Fidel Castro, and how he has impacted his country's development over its history since he's been its leader. One thing you'll notice that makes this such a good resource is that you can get this same article at 4 different lexile levels. So when you need to differentiate to support your students' literacy needs in social studies, this is one of the best resources you can have to be able to find content that's directly aligned to your standards with the type of materials that really would support your students independently reading about the information that you want them to have. There's also writing prompts that go along with it, quizzes that students can take to check to be sure that they understood the article, but you won't be able to access all of this unless you sign in and make yourself an account. Since the account is free, it's really useful, and also you're able to gather your resources in one location to be able to use over time. Also, since it's a news magazine, News ELA source, you're going to have current information. So as things change in the relationship between Cuba and the United States, you'll be able to keep up with those changes. Another aspect of the changes is that we expect Raul Castro to retire in 2018. And that means that there's going to be new leadership in Cuba for the first time in a long time. Will Cuba's government shift again towards more entrenchment in communism, or will it move in a different direction? This will impact how you teach your economic and government and history standards when it comes to Cuba. So it'll be very helpful to you to keep your eye on the news and watch out for what happens, because whatever happens to this neighbor to the south is going to have a big impact on us as well. We hope that you've enjoyed this presentation. As you can see, some of those resources I mentioned are right here at the top. I also hope that the information that it contains will support you in providing excellent instruction in the 6th grade Georgia Standards of Excellence in Social Studies.